In 1847, Montana Territory, a pregnant pioneer woman was about to face the most dangerous night of her life. What started as preparing for her husband's return from a hunting trip took a shocking turn when labor began during the worst blizzard in decades. Sarah McKenna wasn't your typical frontier wife. For 2 years, she had spent her life carving out an existence in the wilderness, known for her fierce independence and unshakable determination to survive against all odds. When she encountered complications delivering twins alone in her isolated cabin, she had no idea she was walking into a life-or-death situation that would challenge everything she believed. Sarah's desperate struggle that would lead to an impossible choice between her deepest prejudices and her children's survival. What began as a woman's solitary battle against nature would become a profound transformation that bridged 2 worlds. The Montana Territory would never be the same after a Creek medicine woman's ancient wisdom saved 3 lives and shattered the barriers between supposed enemies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first snowflakes fell like whispered warnings against the cabin's single window, each flake catching what remained of the gray afternoon light before melting into oblivion. Sarah McKenna pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching the Montana Territory sky darken with a heaviness that made her chest tighten. The twins moved restlessly within her swollen belly, as if sensing her unease, their kicks sharp against her ribs. "Still 3 days," she murmured to herself, trying to find comfort in the familiar rhythm of her own voice. Thomas had promised to return by Saturday, his hunting expedition taking him north toward the Yellowstone River, where the elk were said to be plentiful this season. But Saturday felt impossibly distant now, with the storm gathering strength beyond the mountains, and her body betraying her with its urgent signals. The pain had started as a dull ache in her lower back that morning, something she'd dismissed as the natural consequence of carrying 2 babies through her 8th month. She'd experienced false labor before, sharp, breathless moments that left her clutching the cabin's rough-hewn walls before subsiding into memory. But this felt different, deeper, more insistent. Sarah turned from the window and surveyed her domain with the calculating eye of a woman who had learned to depend on herself. The cabin Thomas had built for them was small but sturdy, its chinked logs and heavy door designed to withstand the brutal Montana winters. Their single room held everything they owned: the iron stove that served for both cooking and warmth, the narrow bed where she'd spent so many nights listening to wolves howl in the distance, and the rough-hewn table where she'd written letters to her mother back in Ohio, letters she could never afford to send. Another contraction seized her, this one strong enough to make her grip the table's edge. She breathed through it the way her mother had taught her during those long afternoons in their cramped Cincinnati tenement, when Mama had shared the hard-won wisdom of 5 births with her only surviving daughter. "When your time comes, Sarah, a girl," her mother had said, her work-worn hands demonstrating on a bundled towel, "you remember that women have been birthing babies since Eve herself. Your body knows what to do, even when your mind don't. Clean linens, hot water, and steady hands, that's all you need." But Mama had never birthed twins alone in a wilderness cabin with the nearest neighbor 5 miles away through forest that would soon be impassable. Mama had never felt the weight of absolute solitude pressing down like the storm clouds now obscuring the mountain peaks. Sarah forced herself into motion, gathering the supplies she'd prepared weeks ago when Thomas first mentioned his hunting trip. Clean sheets, torn from her wedding linens, carefully hoarded in the wooden chest he'd made for her trousseau, the sharp knife she'd sterilized with flame and stored wrapped in boiled cloth, string for the cords, though the thought of cutting her babies free from her body made her hands shake. The wind picked up as she worked, rattling the cabin's shutters, and sending snow devils spinning past the window. Each gust seemed to underscore her isolation, the vast emptiness that stretched for miles in every direction. When they'd first arrived in the territory 2 years ago, that emptiness had felt like freedom, endless possibilities spreading beyond the horizon. Now it felt like a trap. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, feeding the fire with practiced efficiency. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment she could almost imagine Thomas's presence beside her, his steady hands helping with the preparations. But imagination was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the next contraction hit like a fist, clenching around her spine. This one doubled her over, forcing her to grab the stove's edge for support. The heat seared through her dress, but she barely noticed. The pain was different now, focused and purposeful in a way that made her heart race with recognition and terror. "Not yet," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to her babies, or to God, or to the storm itself. "Please, not yet." But even as the words left her lips, she felt the telltale wetness spreading down her legs. Her water had broken, soaking through her heavy wool dress and pooling on the cabin floor. There would be no stopping what came next. No matter how desperately she wished for Thomas's return, or for the storm to pass, or for any of the miracles that never seemed to come when a woman needed them most. She stripped out of her wet dress with trembling fingers, pulling on the loose nightgown she'd set aside for this moment. Each movement was deliberate, mechanical, a way of holding panic at bay through the simple act of preparation. She spread the clean linens on their bed, arranged the knife and string within easy reach, and checked the fire one more time. Outside, the wind had become a constant howl, driving snow against the windows with increasing fury. The storm that had been approaching all day had finally arrived, sealing her fate as surely as if the cabin door had been barred from the outside. Even if she could somehow make it to the Morrison place, 5 miles through the forest, she'd never survive the journey in her condition. The wilderness that had promised them a new life had become her prison just when she needed help most desperately. Another contraction built slowly, starting deep in her back and radiating forward with relentless pressure. She gripped the bedpost and rode it out, counting the seconds until it passed. 45 seconds of pain that left her gasping, and in the brief respite that followed, the terrible arithmetic of labor began writing itself in her mind. The contractions were coming faster now, maybe 10 minutes apart. She had hours ahead of her, long, agonizing hours, and no one to help her through them but herself. The twins kicked and shifted, their movements more frantic now, as if they too sensed the approaching ordeal. Sarah placed both hands on her belly, feeling their shapes beneath her skin, one high under her ribs, the other pressing low against her pelvis in a way that promised difficulty. "We are going to do this together," she told them, her voice steadier. Then she felt, "Your papa will come home to find you both safe and sound, and we'll have such stories to tell him." But as another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, Sarah McKenna understood with crystalline clarity that her survival and her baby's lives now depended entirely on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. The storm raged beyond the cabin walls, and within them an even greater storm was about to begin. But as another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, Sarah McKenna understood with crystalline clarity that her survival and her baby's lives now depended entirely on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. The storm raged beyond the cabin walls, and within them an even greater storm was about to begin. Hours passed in a haze of pain that seemed to stretch time itself. Sarah lost track of everything except the relentless rhythm of contractions that came, closer and closer together, each one building to a crescendo that left her gasping and weak. She tried to remember her mother's instructions, tried to find the calm center that would see her through, but panic kept creeping in at the edges of her consciousness. The first baby had dropped lower, pressing against her pelvis with increasing urgency, but something felt wrong. Instead of the steady progression her mother had described, Sarah felt a different kind of pressure. Sideways. Unnatural. When she reached down between her legs, her trembling fingers encountered not the crown of a head, but something else entirely. A foot. The baby was coming breech. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice lost in the howling wind. Her mother had told her about breech births, how they could trap both mother and child in a deadly struggle, how even experienced midwives sometimes lost both when the cord got compressed or the baby's head became stuck. The next contraction hit with such violence that she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The sound echoed in the small cabin, seeming to mock her isolation. She grabbed the bedpost so hard her knuckles went white, riding out the wave of agony that felt like it might split her in two. When it passed, she was bleeding. Not the normal show of birth, but something more alarming, dark red that soaked through the linens beneath her. She pressed a clean cloth between her legs, but it came away stained crimson. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she was hemorrhaging, her body betraying her when she needed its strength most. "Please," she prayed to whatever deity might be listening in this godforsaken wilderness, "please don't let my babies die because of my weakness." But prayer felt hollow when she could feel her strength ebbing with each contraction. The room began to spin slightly, and she had to grip the bed frame to keep from falling. How long had she been in labor? The storm outside had turned the world into endless night, making it impossible to judge the passage of time. It felt like forever, and yet she knew she still had so far to go. The breech baby's foot was becoming more visible with each push, but instead of relief, Sarah felt only mounting terror. She didn't know how to deliver a breech baby safely. She didn't know how to stop the bleeding. She didn't know how to survive this alone, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing her spirit as surely as the contractions were crushing her body. Another wave of pain, this one so intense that black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She nearly fainted, catching herself only by sheer force of will. But even that will was flagging now, worn down by hours of agony and the growing certainty that she wasn't going to survive this ordeal. The wind outside had reached a howling crescendo, driving snow so hard against the windows that she could barely see beyond the glass. The storm had become a living thing, wrapping around the cabin like a hungry beast, waiting to devour whatever remained when her strength finally gave out. Thomas would return to find her frozen corpse and the bodies of their children, all of them victims of the wilderness that had promised them so much. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to summon the image of her baby's faces, tried to find strength in her love for them. But when the next contraction hit, she felt something tear inside her, and the blood flow increased. She was dying. She could feel it now with absolute certainty. The gradual fading of her strength, the way her thoughts were becoming fuzzy around the edges. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the children she would never hold. "I'm so sorry." She was preparing to surrender to the inevitable when a sound cut through the storm's roar, something that didn't belong to wind or snow. Sarah lifted her head, straining to hear past her own labored breathing. There it was again. A rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps crunching through snow. Her heart leaped with desperate hope. Thomas. Somehow, impossibly, Thomas had returned. Early. He'd sensed her need and come home through the storm to save them all. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a croak. Still, she heard the footsteps approaching the cabin door, steady and purposeful despite the howling wind. "Thomas!" she managed to gasp. "Thomas, help me!" But when the door opened with a creak of hinges, the figure that stepped inside was not her husband. Through eyes blurred with pain and exhaustion, Sarah saw someone smaller, dressed in strange clothing that seemed to blend with the storm itself. Fear shot through her. Indians, she thought wildly. The stories Thomas and the other settlers told came flooding back. Savage raids, scalping, torture. She was defenseless, bleeding, unable to run or fight. The figure closed the door against the storm and stood still for a moment, as if assessing the situation. Sarah could make out little in the firelight except that it was a woman, elderly, with long grey hair that hung in intricate braids. Her clothing was unlike anything Sarah had seen before, layers of worn leather and woven fabric that spoke of a culture completely foreign to her own experience. "Please," Sarah whispered, not sure if she was begging for mercy or for help. "Please, don't hurt us." The woman stepped closer, and in the flickering firelight, Sarah could see her face clearly for the first time. It was weathered and lined with age, but her dark eyes held a sharp intelligence and something else, concern, professional assessment. The woman looked at Sarah's condition, at the blood-soaked linens, at the obvious signs of a birth gone wrong, and her entire demeanor changed. She moved with sudden purpose, setting down a leather bag Sarah hadn't noticed before, and approaching the bed with the confident steps of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. When she spoke, her voice was heavily accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. "You are in trouble," she said simply. "Baby is wrong way. You lose much blood." Sarah stared at her in shock. This was not what she had expected from the savage Indians of settlers' stories. This woman spoke English, assessed medical situations, carried what appeared to be a healer's bag. And most importantly, she didn't seem interested in scalping or torturing anyone. She seemed interested in solving a medical crisis. Who are you?" Sarah managed between contractions. "I am Ayana," the woman replied, already rolling up her sleeves. "I help women birth babies, many, many babies." She looked directly into Sarah's eyes with a steady gaze that somehow conveyed both competence and compassion. "You trust me, or you die. Babies die too." It was perhaps the starkest choice Sarah had ever faced. Everything she had been taught about Indians warred with the evidence of her own eyes and the desperate reality of her situation. The stories said they were savage, untrustworthy, barely human. But the woman standing before her radiated the same calm competence Sarah had seen in the few doctors she'd encountered in her life. Another contraction hit, this one so violent that Sarah screamed again. When it passed, she was weaker than before, and the bleeding seemed worse. She could feel her life draining away with each heartbeat, and with it, the lives of her children. Ayana was watching her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Choose now," she said quietly. "Trust, or die choosing." Pride. Sarah looked at this unexpected savior, this Creek medicine woman who had appeared out of the storm like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to speak. Everything she had been taught told her to refuse help from someone like this. But everything she felt in her heart told her that without this woman's help, none of them would see another sunrise. "Help me," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please help us." Ayana nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance. She moved toward her leather bag with purposeful efficiency, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what lay inside. Bundled herbs, carved tools, and implements that spoke of medical knowledge accumulated over decades of experience. "Good," Ayana said, her hands already beginning their work. "Now we save your babies." But as another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, Sarah McKenna understood with crystalline clarity that her survival and her baby's lives now depended entirely on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. The storm raged beyond the cabin walls, and within them, an even greater storm was about to begin. Hours passed in a haze of pain that seemed to stretch time itself. Sarah lost track of everything except the relentless rhythm of contractions that came. Closer and closer together, each one building to a crescendo that left her gasping and weak. She tried to remember her mother's instructions, tried to find the calm center that would see her through, but panic kept creeping in at the edges of her consciousness. The first baby had dropped lower, pressing against her pelvis with increasing urgency, but something felt wrong. Instead of the steady progression her mother had described, Sarah felt a different kind of pressure, sideways, unnatural. When she reached down between her legs, her trembling fingers encountered not the crown of a head, but something else entirely. A foot. The baby was coming breech. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice lost in the howling wind. Her mother had told her about breech births, how they could trap both mother and child in a deadly struggle, how even experienced midwives sometimes lost both when the cord got compressed or the baby's head became stuck. The next contraction hit with such violence that she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The sound echoed in the small cabin, seeming to mock her isolation. She grabbed the bedpost so hard her knuckles went white, riding out the wave of agony that felt like it might split her in two. When it passed, she was bleeding. Not the normal show of birth, but something more alarming. Dark, red that soaked through the linens beneath her. She pressed a clean cloth between her legs, but it came away stained crimson. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she was hemorrhaging, her body betraying her when she needed its strength most. "Please," she prayed to whatever deity might be listening in this God-forsaken wilderness, "please don't let my babies die because of my weakness." But prayer felt hollow when she could feel her strength ebbing with each contraction. The room began to spin slightly, and she had to grip the bed frame to keep from falling. How long had she been in labor? The storm outside had turned the world into endless night, making it impossible to judge the passage of time. It felt like forever, and yet she knew she still had so far to go. The breech baby's foot was becoming more visible with each push, but instead of relief, Sarah felt only mounting terror. She didn't know how to deliver a breech baby safely. She didn't know how to stop the bleeding. She didn't know how to survive this alone, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing her spirit as surely as the contractions were crushing her body. Another wave of pain, this one so intense that black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She nearly fainted, catching herself only by sheer force of will. But even that will was flagging now, worn down by hours of agony and the growing certainty that she wasn't going to survive this ordeal. The wind outside had reached a howling crescendo, driving snow so hard against the windows that she could barely see beyond the glass. The storm had become a living thing, wrapping around the cabin like a hungry beast, waiting to devour whatever remained when her strength finally gave out. Thomas would return to find her frozen corpse and the bodies of their children, all of them victims of the wilderness that had promised them so much. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to summon the image of her baby's faces, tried to find strength in her love for them. But when the next contraction hit, she felt something tear inside her and the blood flow increased. She was dying. She could feel it now with absolute certainty. The gradual fading of her strength, the way her thoughts were becoming fuzzy around the edges. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the children she would never hold. "I'm so sorry." She was preparing to surrender to the inevitable when a sound cut through the storm's roar, something that didn't belong to wind or snow. Sarah lifted her head, straining to hear past her own labored breathing. There it was again, a rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps crunching through snow. Her heart lapped with desperate hope. Thomas. Somehow, impossibly, Thomas had returned early. He'd sensed her need and come home through the storm to save them all. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a croak. Still, she heard the footsteps approaching the cabin door, steady and purposeful, despite the howling wind. "Thomas!" she managed to gasp. "Thomas, help me!" But when the door opened with a creak of hinges, the figure that stepped inside was not her husband. Through eyes blurred with pain and exhaustion, Sarah saw someone smaller, dressed in strange clothing that seemed to blend with the storm itself. Fear shot through her. Indians, she thought wildly. The stories Thomas and the other settlers told came flooding back. Savage raids, scalping, torture. She was defenseless, bleeding, unable to run or fight. The figure closed the door against the storm and stood still for a moment, as if assessing the situation. Sarah could make out little in the firelight, except that it was a woman, elderly, with long grey hair that hung in intricate braids. Her clothing was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. Layers of worn leather and woven fabric that spoke of a culture completely foreign to her own experience. "Please," Sarah whispered, not sure if she was begging for mercy or for help. "Please don't hurt us." The woman stepped closer, and in the flickering firelight, Sarah could see her face clearly for the first time. It was weathered and lined with age, but her dark eyes held a sharp intelligence and something else. Concern. Professional assessment. The woman looked at Sarah's condition, at the blood-soaked linens, at the obvious signs of a birth gone wrong, and her entire demeanor changed. She moved with sudden purpose, setting down a leather bag Sarah hadn't noticed before and approaching the bed with the confident steps of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. When she spoke, her voice was heavily accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. "You are in trouble," she said simply. "Baby is wrong way. You lose much blood." Sarah stared at her in shock. This was not what she had expected from the savage Indians of settlers' stories. This woman spoke English, assessed medical situations, carried what appeared to be a healer's bag. And most importantly, she didn't seem interested in scalping or torturing anyone. She seemed interested in solving a medical crisis. Who are you?" Sarah managed between contractions. "I am Ayana," the woman replied, already rolling up her sleeves. "I help women birth babies, many, many babies." She looked directly into Sarah's eyes with a steady gaze that somehow conveyed both competence and compassion. "You trust me, or you die. Babies die too." It was perhaps the starkest choice Sarah had ever faced. Everything she had been taught about Indians warred with the evidence of her own eyes and the desperate reality of her situation. The stories said they were savage, untrustworthy, barely human. But the woman standing before her radiated the same calm competence Sarah had seen in the few doctors she'd encountered in her life. Another contraction hit, this one so violent that Sarah screamed again. When it passed, she was weaker than before, and the bleeding seemed worse. She could feel her life draining away with each heartbeat, and with it the lives of her children. Ayana was watching her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Choose now," she said quietly. "Trust, or die choosing." Pride. Sarah looked at this unexpected savior, this Creek medicine woman, who had appeared out of the storm like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to speak. Everything she had been taught told her to refuse help from someone like this. But everything, she felt in her heart, told her that without this woman's help, none of them would see another sunrise. "Help me?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please help us." Ayana nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance. She moved toward her leather bag with purposeful efficiency, and Sarah caught a glimpse of what lay inside: bundled herbs, carved tools, and implements that spoke of medical knowledge accumulated over decades of experience. "Good," Ayana said, her hands already beginning their work. "Now we save your babies." Even as the words left her lips, Sarah felt a wave of terror wash over her. What had she done? Every story she'd ever heard about Indians came flooding back. Tales of torture, of scalping, of unspeakable cruelties inflicted on helpless settlers. Thomas had warned her never to trust them, never to let one into their home. And here she was, naked and vulnerable, completely at the mercy of a woman whose people were supposed to be her enemies. "Wait!" Sarah gasped as another contraction began to build. I don't know if—" But Ayana was already washing her hands in the basin of hot water, her movements swift and purposeful. She glanced at Sarah with those sharp, dark eyes, and there was something almost impatient in her expression. "You change mind now?" she asked, drying her hands on a clean cloth. "Baby not wait for you to decide if Creek woman good enough to save white woman's life." The bluntness of it cut through Sarah's panic. This wasn't about trust or prejudice or the stories settlers told around their fires. This was about life and death, and the woman standing beside her. Bed was the only person within miles who might know how to prevent both from slipping away. Another contraction hit, this one so violent that Sarah's back arched off the bed. When it passed, she was panting and weak, and she could feel more blood soaking the linens beneath her. Ayana watched her carefully, then nodded once, as if confirming something she already knew. "Bleeding too much," she said matter-of-factly. "Baby stuck wrong way. You wait much longer, you die. Babies die." She opened her leather bag and began removing items, bundles of dried herbs, carved wooden tools, strips of clean bark. "I fix. But you must do what I say. No questions, no fear of Indian magic, only listen and live." Sarah stared at the strange implements, her mind reeling. Everything about this felt wrong, felt dangerous. But when she looked at Ayana's hands, steady, confident, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this countless times, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. "How do I know you won't?" Sarah began, then stopped. How could she voice her fears without insulting the woman who might be her salvation? Ayana looked at her directly, and for a moment her professional demeanor softened slightly. "You think I come through storm to hurt babies?" she asked quietly. "I am medicine woman. I help life come into world. Doesn't matter if mother is Creek, or Cherokee, or—" She gestured at Sarah. "White woman who thinks I am savage." The rebuke was gentle but pointed, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Here was this woman, risking her own safety to help a complete stranger, and Sarah was questioning her motives based on nothing but the color of her skin and the stories told by people who had probably never spoken to an Indian in their lives. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I don't know, I've never—" "I know," Ayana said simply. She selected a bundle of herbs from her bag and began crushing them between her palms. "Your people tell many stories about my people. My people tell stories too, but stories not important now, only baby important." She moved to Sarah's side and gently examined the breech presentation. Her touch was professional, confident, completely unlike the fumbling attempts Sarah had made to understand what was happening to her body. As Ayana worked, she spoke in a low, calm voice. "Baby is trying to come feet first. Very dangerous. But I have delivered many like this." Her hands were working now, doing something Sarah couldn't see but could certainly feel. A careful manipulation that was uncomfortable but not painful. "Your body is strong. Baby is strong. We work together." Despite herself, Sarah found the woman's calm confidence reassuring. Ayana worked with the sure movements of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft, and gradually Sarah began to relax into her touch. The bleeding was slowing, she realized with amazement. Whatever Ayana had done, it was working. "There," Ayana said with satisfaction. "Baby turns. Now we wait for next pain, and you push when I tell you." The next contraction came like a wave, but this time it felt different, productive rather than simply agonizing. Ayana placed one hand on Sarah's belly and used the other to guide the baby's progress. "Push now," she commanded, and Sarah bore down with all her remaining strength. She felt something give way, felt movement and pressure, and then sudden blessed relief as the baby slipped free. Ayana caught the tiny form in capable hands, and Sarah heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a strong, angry cry that filled the cabin and seemed to drive back the storm itself. "Girl, baby," Ayana announced, clearing the infant's mouth and nose with practiced efficiency. "Good lungs, good color." She placed the baby on Sarah's chest, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at her daughter for the first time. The baby was perfect, tiny but healthy, with a cap of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at her mother. Sarah cradled her daughter against her skin, marveling at the warmth and weight of her. "Mary," she whispered. "Your name is Mary." But even as she spoke, she felt another contraction building. The second baby was coming, and she could see from Ayana's expression that this birth might prove even more challenging than the first. Ayana was already preparing new herbs, mixing them into a paste that she applied to strips of bark. "First baby easy," she said without looking up. "Second baby." She paused, meeting Sarah's eyes. "Second baby we worry about after second baby comes." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Mary was safe in her arms, but she still had another child to deliver, and she could see the concern in Ayana's weathered face. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. The woman she had been taught to fear had already saved one life tonight. Now Sarah could only pray that her unlikely savior could work another miracle before the storm, both outside and within her body, claimed them all. The second contraction came with renewed urgency, and Sarah felt the familiar pressure building again. But this time, with Mary warm and breathing against her chest, she felt stronger, more hopeful. Ayana had already proven herself once tonight. "Baby comes fast now," Ayana observed, her hands moving to support the emerging infant. "Good. Storm grows worse. We finish before—" Her words were cut off as the baby slipped free, but instead of the lusty cry that had announced Mary's arrival, there was only silence. Terrible, frightening silence. Sarah tried to sit up, straining to see. "What's wrong? Why isn't he crying?" Ayana had caught the baby, a boy Sarah could see, but his tiny form was motionless, his skin a frightening blue-gray color. The medicine woman's face was grim as she quickly cleared his mouth and nose, then held him upside down and tapped his back sharply. Nothing. "He's not breathing," Sarah whispered, terror rising in her throat. "Oh God, he's not breathing." But Ayana was already moving with swift purpose, laying the baby on the clean linen beside Sarah. Her hands moved over his tiny chest, pressing gently, rhythmically. When that produced no response, she did something that made Sarah's blood run. "Cold," the Creek woman began to chant. It was a low, melodic sound in a language Sarah didn't understand, but the rhythm of it seemed to match some ancient heartbeat. Ayana's hands moved in patterns over the baby's body, not touching, but somehow drawing energy from the air itself. To Sarah's eyes, it looked exactly like the savage rituals the missionaries had warned about, the heathen practices that marked the difference between civilization and barbarism. "What are you doing?" Sarah demanded, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Calling his spirit back," Ayana replied without stopping her movements. "Sometimes babies forget to breathe in this world. Must remind them they are needed. Here." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. When she opened it, Sarah saw dried herbs, unlike anything she'd ever encountered. Some that seemed to shimmer in the firelight, others that released a pungent, almost medicinal scent. Ayana selected several of the herbs and crumbled them in two. Her palm then held them close to the baby's nose. The smell was sharp, clean, like breathing mountain air after a thunderstorm. As the aromatic smoke rose from her cupped hands, she continued her chanting, and Sarah found herself holding her breath along with her son. "My nephew," Ayana said quietly, never stopping her work, "was born like this. Blue baby, no breath." Her voice carried a weight of old grief. "His name was Little Fox, quick and clever, always getting into trouble." She selected another herb, this one darker, and began mixing it with something from a small clay pot. When the soldiers came to move our people, Little Fox was just learning to walk. Strong legs, bright eyes. Sarah watched in fascination as Ayana applied the herbal mixture to the baby's chest and temples. The smell grew stronger, and Sarah could swear she felt it opening her own airways, making each breath cleaner and deeper than the last. The march was long, Ayana continued, her hands now working in smooth circles over the baby's body. Many died, old ones, sick ones, and the children, her voice caught slightly, the children who could not keep up. Samuel, for Sarah had already named him in her heart, gave a tiny gasp. It was barely audible, but Ayana's head snapped up immediately, her dark eyes intense with focus. "There," she whispered. "He hears us." She began a different chant now, one that seemed lighter, more welcoming. Her hands moved in new patterns, and Sarah could see tiny movements in Samuel's chest. Irregular, uncertain, but definitely there. Little Fox tried to help the other children, Ayana said, never taking her eyes off Samuel. He would share his water, carry their bundles when they got tired, but the soldiers... She paused, selecting yet another herb from her collection. This one she burned, creating a thin stream of smoke that she waved gently toward the baby's face. "They said we moved too slow. The children who couldn't walk fast enough would be left behind." Samuel's breathing was becoming more regular now, his color slowly shifting from blue-gray toward a healthier pink. Sarah watched in amazement as techniques she'd been taught were primitive superstition proved more effective than anything she'd ever witnessed. "Little Fox got sick on the march," Ayana continued, her voice soft with memory. "Fever, then his breathing became hard, like your baby. I tried everything, every medicine my grandmother taught me, every ceremony my mother's mother knew." She looked directly at Sarah then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But I was young then, scared, and we had no safe place to work. No clean water, no time to let the medicines do their work properly." Samuel suddenly drew a deep, shuddering breath, then another. His cry, when it came, was weak but definitely alive. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she reached for her son, gathering him against her other side next to Mary. "You saved him," she whispered. "You brought him back." Ayana nodded, but her expression remained serious. "This time, yes. But Little Fox..." She began gathering her herbs with careful precision, wrapping each bundle separately. "I lost Little Fox because I could not make the white soldiers understand that healing takes time, takes proper medicine, takes respect for the spirits that guard life." Sarah looked down at her son, breathing, pink, alive, then back at the woman who had saved him using knowledge that Sarah's people dismissed as savage ignorance. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "How many others?" she asked quietly. "How many people have died because we don't understand?" Ayana's hands stilled in their work. "Too many," she said simply. "That is why I travel now." Why I learn your language, why I study what your doctors do. Maybe someday both kinds of medicine work together instead of against each other. Samuel's breathing had steadied completely now, his color healthy and normal. As Sarah held both, her children close, she understood that she was witnessing something far more profound than just successful medical treatment. She was seeing the preservation of ancient wisdom, carried by a woman who had lost everything but refused to let her knowledge die with her. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, the words inadequate for what she truly felt. "Thank you for not giving up." Ayanna smiled then, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her. "Life is sacred," she said simply. "All life. When we save one, we honor all who could not be saved." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, 3 lives had been preserved through the meeting of 2 worlds that were supposed to be enemies. Sarah held her babies close and wondered what other truths she'd been wrong about all her life. The hours that followed passed in a strange, suspended peace. While the blizzard raged beyond the cabin walls, inside there was warmth, quiet voices, and the soft sounds of newborn breathing. Ayanna moved around the small space with the comfortable efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself useful wherever she found herself. But there was nothing intrusive about her presence. Instead, Sarah found herself oddly comforted by the older woman's calm competence. "You must eat," Ayanna said, stirring something fragrant in a small pot she'd produced from her seemingly bottomless bag. "Build strength for feeding babies." Sarah realized she was indeed hungry, ravenously so, in a way she hadn't been for weeks. The smell rising from Ayanna's pot was unlike anything she'd ever encountered. Earthy, complex, with undertones of herbs and what might have been dried meat. "What is it?" Sarah asked, shifting carefully to accommodate both babies, who had settled into the drowsy contentment of well-fed newborns. "Travel food," Ayanna replied, ladling the mixture into a wooden bowl. "Dried venison, roots, berries, things that keep woman strong when she has no home to rest in." She handed Sarah the bowl along with a carved wooden spoon. "Eat is good for milk." The first taste was a revelation. Sarah had expected something primitive, unpalatable, but instead found flavors that seemed to awaken every part of her mouth. The meat was tender despite being dried, seasoned with herbs that made her think of summer meadows and clean mountain streams. The roots provided substance and earthiness, while tiny dried berries added bursts of sweetness that balanced the savory. "Elements perfectly. This is wonderful," Sarah said, surprised by her own enthusiasm. "How do you make it?" Ayanna settled herself on the small stool beside the bed, her own bowl in her hands. "My grandmother taught me. Her grandmother taught her. Each woman adds something new, makes it better." She took a thoughtful bite. "I add wild mint, makes digestion easier when you eat while walking many miles." "You walk everywhere?" Sarah asked, then immediately felt foolish. Of course she did. What tribes had horses anymore, with settlers taking the best land and the government confining Indians to reservations? But Ayanna didn't seem offended by the question. "Sometimes walk, sometimes find rides with traders who are not afraid of Greek woman, mostly walk." She gestured toward the storm outside, was heading south when storm caught me, saw smoke from your chimney. "Where do you live?" Sarah found herself genuinely curious about this woman's life, this existence so different from anything she could imagine. "Nowhere. Everywhere." Ayanna's expression grew distant. "After the soldiers moved us from our land, after the march." She paused, her hands stilling on her bowl. "I could not stay on reservation, too many ghosts there, so I travel between scattered families, share medicine, learn new things." Sarah watched Ayanna's face as she spoke, seeing grief there, but also something else, a kind of purposeful determination that reminded her of her own mother's stubborn refusal to let poverty break her spirit. "Don't you get lonely?" Sarah asked softly. Ayana looked at her with those penetrating dark eyes. "Do you?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She opened her mouth to say no, of course not. She had Thomas and their life together. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was she had been lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in ways she'd never allowed herself to acknowledge. "Yes," she whispered, surprised by her own honesty. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing out here, like I could die and no one would notice for weeks." "Why, you come here then?" Ayana asked gently. "This far from your people?" Sarah shifted the babies, considering how to explain. "Thomas said there would be opportunity here. Land we could own, a chance to build something." She looked around the small cabin, seeing it suddenly through new eyes. The rough walls, the single window, the furniture Thomas had made from trees he'd cut himself. "Back in Ohio, we lived in a room smaller than this. 10 families in one. Building, sharing everything, I thought." She trailed off, remembering those dreams of prosperity and independence. "You thought it would be better to be alone than to be crowded," Ayana finished. "Yes, but I didn't understand what alone really meant." Ayana nodded slowly. "I understand this feeling. When my husband died in the march when little Fox..." She set down her bowl and reached toward Mary, who was beginning to fuss. "May I?" Sarah found herself nodding without hesitation, watching as Ayana lifted her daughter with the practiced ease of someone who had held many babies. The older woman began to hum, a low, melodic sound that seemed to calm Mary immediately. "Creek, lullaby," Ayana explained quietly. "My mother sang to me, I sang to little Fox." Her voice carried old pain, but also love. Music travels even when people cannot. As Ayana hummed, Sarah found herself studying the woman's face more closely. The deep lines around her eyes spoke of both laughter and sorrow, while her hands, scarred and weathered from years of travel and work, moved with infinite gentleness as she cradled the baby. "Tell me about your husband," Sarah said impulsively. Ayana's humming paused for a moment. "Strong eagle, good man, good hunter, good father to his sister's children." She resumed her gentle swaying. "He got sick during March, fever like many. Others, I tried everything but..." She shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and enduring grief. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, meaning it deeply. "Long time ago now. But you..." Ayana looked at Sarah directly. "Your husband, he is good man too." Sarah considered the question more carefully than she would have even a day ago. "He tries to be. He works hard, wants to provide for us. But..." She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "He would not understand about tonight, about you helping us." Ayana nodded knowingly. "He fears my people." "Yes, he's heard stories." "I know the stories your people tell." Ayana's voice was matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "My people tell stories too, about settlers who take land, who kill without reason, who make promises they do not keep." She looked down at Mary, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "But stories are not always truth. Sometimes they keep us from seeing what is really in front of us." Sarah felt a flush of shame. "I believed those stories. Before tonight I would have." "You would have been afraid," Ayana said simply. "Fear makes people do things they regret later. But tonight you chose to trust. That took courage." "I was dying. I didn't have a choice." "There is always choice. You could have chosen to die rather than accept help from Indian woman. Some, he would have." Sarah stared at her, horrified by the truth of that statement. She could easily imagine Thomas making exactly that choice, preferring death to the shame of being saved by someone he considered beneath him. Ayana gently transferred Mary back to Sarah's arms. then reached for Samuel. "These babies," she said, settling him against her shoulder with practiced ease, "they will grow up knowing different truth than their parents learned. Maybe that is how change happens, one child at a time." As Sarah watched this woman, this supposed enemy, tenderly caring for her son, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The fear was gone, replaced by something she hadn't expected. Gratitude, yes, but also genuine affection. Sitting here in the lamplight, sharing food and stories while caring for newborns together, felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I wish," Sarah began, then stopped. "What you wish? I wish you could stay. I wish Thomas could meet you like this, see what I've seen tonight." Sarah's voice grew wistful. "I wish things could be different." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow circles on Samuel's back. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Things can be different, but difference starts with one person, then another, like ripples in water." She looked at Sarah meaningfully. "You are changed now. That change will touch your children, maybe your husband, maybe others." Outside, the wind had begun to quiet slightly, though snow still pelted the windows. Sarah realized that dawn wasn't far away, and with it would come the end of this strange, miraculous night. The thought filled her with unexpected sadness. "I don't want you to go," she admitted quietly. Ayanna smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Part of me stays with you now. Part of you comes with me when I leave. That is how it works when women help each other bring life into world." Sarah nodded, understanding in a way that went deeper than words. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would never be quite as alone as she had been before this night. The knowledge Ayanna had shared, the connection they had forged, would remain long after the storm passed and the older woman disappeared back into the wilderness from which she had emerged. But for now, in the peaceful hours before dawn, they sat together in comfortable silence, two women from different worlds, united by the ancient sacred work of nurturing new life. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's frost-covered window, and with it came the crushing weight of reality. Sarah had been dreading this moment throughout the long night, but now that it was here, she felt utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, the howling wind subsiding to intermittent gusts that no longer shook the cabin's walls. Ayanna noticed the change immediately. She lifted her head from where she'd been dozing in the chair, her weathered hands still cradling Samuel, and looked toward the window with the alert expression of someone accustomed to reading the subtle signs of weather. "Storm passes," she said quietly. "Sun comes soon." Sarah felt her chest tighten. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 2 hours before trails are safe for walking. Your husband?" Ayanna paused, studying Sarah's face. "When he returns?" "Today? Probably, maybe tomorrow if the snow is too deep." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "He'll see tracks, won't he? Evidence that someone was here?" Ayanna nodded slowly. "Snow covers some things, but not all. And I left signs. Herb. Smell, different way of arranging things." She gestured around the cabin, and Sarah realized that indeed everything looked slightly different than it had before Ayanna's arrival. Cleaner, more organized, but in ways that Thomas would notice immediately. The babies were both sleeping, peacefully, their breathing steady and strong. Looking at them, Sarah felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. These children owed their lives to the woman sitting across from her, and the thought of denying that truth felt like a betrayal of everything sacred. "I could tell him the truth," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was impossible. Ayanna's expression was kind but firm. "You could, but then what happens to me?" What happens to you when your husband's anger comes? Sarah closed her eyes, imagining Thomas's reaction to finding an Indian woman in their home, holding his children. The rage would be immediate and terrible. He might even assume the worst, that Ayana had been planning to harm them, that Sarah had been held captive. His prejudices ran too deep for rational explanation, and the consequences would be devastating for everyone involved. He would never understand, Sarah admitted. Even if I explained everything, he would only see. Indian woman who should not be trusted, Ayana finished. Yes, I know this. She stood carefully, settling Samuel back in Sarah's arms before moving to gather her scattered belongings. So we make different story that keeps everyone safe. Watching Ayana pack her medicine bag, Sarah felt a desperate urge to stop her, to insist that there had to be another way. The thought of lying to Thomas about something so fundamental felt wrong, but the alternative was unthinkable. What story? Sarah asked reluctantly. Ayana paused in her packing, considering. You are a strong woman. Strong women sometimes do impossible things when their children's lives depend on it. She looked directly at Sarah. You delivered twins alone in storm. First baby came hard, but you managed. Second baby had trouble breathing, but you... She moved to her bag and withdrew a small bundle of herbs. You remembered something your mother taught you. Old remedy. Maybe she learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from someone else long ago. Sarah stared at the herbs. What are they? Same ones I used for your son. Dried sweetgrass, wild mint, other things. Ayana began separating the bundle into smaller portions, wrapping each in pieces of soft bark. Your people, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Used these medicines too, long ago, before they forgot the old ways. Not all knowledge came from my people first. It was a generous fiction, and Sarah recognized it as such. But it also contained a thread of possible truth. Perhaps some of the healing traditions had crossed cultural boundaries over the years, shared between people who had found common ground despite their differences. How do I use them? Sarah asked. Ayana settled beside her again, her movements patient and instructional. If babies get sick, fever, trouble breathing, stomach pain, you make tea with this. She indicated one bundle. Very weak tea, just a few leaves in hot water. Let cool until warm. Give drops with clean cloth. She moved to another bundle. This one for you. After birth bleeding, pain in belly, infection, stronger tea, drink small amounts. Her fingers moved to a third package. This for wounds, cuts, crush leaves, make paste with clean water. As Ayana explained each remedy, Sarah committed every detail to memory. This knowledge felt precious, irreplaceable, not just because it might save her children's lives someday, but because it was a tangible connection to the woman who had saved them all. You cannot tell anyone where you learned this, Ayana said. Seriously, if people ask, you remember story about your mother, your grandmother, old family knowledge. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of what was being entrusted to her. These weren't just medicines. They were secrets that could endanger Ayana if they were traced back to their source. What about the birth itself? Sarah asked. How do I explain managing twins alone, especially with Samuel's complications? Ayana was quiet for a moment, thinking. You tell truth about most things. Pain was very bad. Bleeding was heavy. You were scared. But you say first baby came normal. Second baby you had to work harder for. When he didn't breathe right away, you... She gestured toward the herbs. You tried old remedy your mother mentioned once. It worked. The story was plausible, Sarah realized. Women throughout history had managed difficult births alone, and the use of traditional remedies was common enough that it wouldn't raise suspicions. The only deception was in the source of the knowledge, and that lie would protect them all. "I hate this," Sarah said suddenly, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "I hate that I have to lie about the most important night of my life. I hate that I can't tell people what you did for us." Ayana's expression softened with understanding. Truth is not always about words. Truth is in how you live, how you treat people, how you raise your children. She reached out and gently touched Mary's tiny hand. "These babies will grow up knowing that all people deserve respect. That is truth that matters more than stories." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The injustice of it was overwhelming, that such kindness and skill had to be hidden, that prejudice could force them to deny the very thing that had saved their lives. "Will I ever see you again?" Sarah asked. Ayana's smile was sad, but warm. "Maybe. I travel through this area sometimes, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It would not be safe for either of us to plan such meetings. Too many people watch, too many people judge." The finality of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. This woman had become more real to her, in one night than most people she'd known for years. And now she was going to disappear as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving only memories and hidden medicines behind. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah whispered. "You thank me by keeping babies healthy, by remembering that medicine comes from many places, wisdom comes from many people." Ayana stood and shouldered her bag, then moved toward the door. "And maybe by teaching your husband that not all stories he hears are true." Sarah tried to imagine having that conversation with Thomas and failed completely. How could she challenge his deepest beliefs without revealing why she now knew them to be wrong? "I don't know if I'm brave enough for that," Sarah admitted. Ayana paused at the door, looking back with those penetrating dark eyes. "You were brave enough to trust me when you were dying. You were brave enough to let Creek Woman touch your babies. That is very brave." She opened the door, letting in a rush of cold air and swirling snow. Bravery grows with practice. The wind had indeed calmed, and through the grey dawn light, Sarah could see that the worst of the storm had passed. Snow still fell, but gently now, without the driving fury of the night before. "Wait!" Sarah called out as Ayana stepped toward the threshold. The older woman turned back, and Sarah struggled to find words for everything she was feeling. If something happens to me, if Thomas finds out somehow, I want you to know that I would never betray you. Never." Ayana's expression grew solemn. "I know this. Just as you must know that part of my heart stays here with you and your children. When I'm far away, walking other trails, I will think of you and hope you are well." With that, she stepped out into the snowy dawn, her form immediately beginning to blur in the falling snow. Sarah watched from the doorway as Ayana's figure grew smaller and more indistinct, until finally she disappeared entirely into the white landscape, as if she had never been there at all. Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, holding both babies close. The cabin felt enormous and empty without Ayana's presence, and the weight of the secret she now carried settled over her like a heavy blanket. She looked around the room, noting all the small changes, the way the herbs had been arranged on the table, the extra cleanliness, the faint lingering scent of unfamiliar medicines. Moving carefully, she began to erase the evidence of Ayana's presence. She rearranged items to look more like her usual housekeeping, aired out the cabin to dispel the herbal scents, and hid the precious medicine bundles in the bottom of her sewing basket where Thomas would never think to look. As she worked, she practiced the story she would tell. The labor had been difficult, yes. She had been terrified and in pain. The first baby had come after many hours of struggle, and the second had been even harder. When Samuel hadn't breathed, immediately, she had tried an old remedy her mother had mentioned, something about herbs that could help with breathing troubles. It had worked, by the grace of God, and both babies were healthy. The story felt hollow in her mouth, a pale shadow of the miraculous reality. But it was a story that would keep them all safe, and sometimes safety required sacrificing complete truth. By the time she heard Thomas's voice calling her name from outside, Sarah had transformed the cabin back into something that looked like the scene of a woman's solitary struggle. She had changed into a clean nightgown, washed away the remaining evidence of birth, and arranged herself in bed with the twins as if she had never moved. "Sarah!" Thomas called again, and she could hear the worry in his voice. "Sarah, are you all right?" "She's in here," she called back, making her voice sound weak and tired. "Thomas, come quickly." The door burst open and Thomas stumbled inside, snow still clinging to his coat and beard. His eyes went immediately to the bed, taking in the sight of Sarah with two tiny bundles in her arms, and his face transformed with wonder and relief. "My God," he breathed, crossing to the bed in 3 quick strides. "The babies. They're here? They're both healthy," Sarah finished, managing a tired smile. "Thomas, meet your son and daughter." He sank onto the edge of the bed, his hands shaking as he reached toward the babies. "I tried to get back as soon as the storm started, but the trails were impossible. I was so worried." He looked at her with amazement and concern. "How did you manage alone in the storm?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her careful version of the truth, watching Thomas's face as she spoke. She saw pride there and awe at what she had supposedly accomplished alone. But she also saw the assumptions he was making, that his strong, capable wife had somehow triumphed through sheer determination and perhaps divine intervention. He never questioned how she had known to use herbs for Samuel's breathing troubles. He never wondered where she had learned the techniques that had saved them all. To Thomas, the story fit perfectly with his understanding of the world. His people were resourceful and blessed by God, while the others remained safely distant and irrelevant to their lives. As Sarah finished her tale, she felt the weight of the secret settling permanently into her heart. This was her burden now, to carry the truth of that night alone, to protect both Ayanna's memory and her family's safety through careful silence. But even as she accepted that burden, she knew that something fundamental had changed inside her. The woman who had given birth in terror and ignorance was gone forever, replaced by someone who had seen beyond the boundaries of her small world and found wisdom in the most unexpected place. Thomas kissed her forehead and began fussing over the babies, his joy and relief filling the cabin with warmth, and Sarah smiled and accepted his congratulations, all the while holding close the secret knowledge that the greatest gift he would ever receive had come from the hands of a woman. He would never acknowledge as human. The truth was heavy, but it was hers to carry. And in carrying it, she honored both the woman who had saved them and the children who would grow up in a world that might, someday, be different than the one their parents had known. In the days that followed, Sarah discovered that living with a secret was like carrying a stone in her chest, a constant weight that made every breath deliberate, every word carefully measured. Thomas was euphoric about the twins, spending hours marveling at their tiny fingers and toes, proudly declaring them the strongest, most beautiful babies ever born. His joy was infectious and genuine, and Sarah found herself caught between the pleasure of his happiness and the ache of her hidden truth. "I can't believe you managed all this alone," he said for perhaps the 10th time, cradling Mary while Sarah nursed Samuel. "Most women need other women around, midwives, mothers, but my Sarah." He beamed at her with such pride that she had to look away. "You're stronger than any woman I've ever known." Each compliment felt like a small betrayal of Ayanna's memory. Sarah wanted to tell him about the real strength she'd witnessed, the Calm competence of weathered hands, bringing life back to still lungs, the ancient wisdom that had saved them all. Instead, she smiled and accepted his praise, adding another layer to the growing wall between them. "I had help," she said quietly, meaning it in ways he could never understand. "God's help," Thomas agreed, kissing Mary's forehead. "Divine providence, that's what it was. The Lord looking after his faithful." Sarah bit back the response that rose to her lips. If divine providence had been involved, it had taken the form of a Creek medicine woman who carried healing in her hands and stories of loss in her heart, but that truth would remain forever unspoken between them. On the third day after Thomas's return, he came in from checking their small livestock with a troubled expression that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Found some strange tracks around the property," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Old ones, mostly covered by the storm, but still visible if you know what to look for." Sarah's heart began to race, but she kept her voice level. "What kind of tracks?" "Moccasins. Definitely Indian." Thomas moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape. "Came right up to the cabin, looks like, during the storm." "That's impossible," Sarah said, perhaps too quickly. "No one could have traveled in that weather." Thomas turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Indians can travel in weather that would kill a white man, Sarah. They know the land differently than we do." He paused, studying her face. "You didn't see or hear anything? Nothing unusual during the storm?" Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I was in labor, Thomas. I wasn't paying attention to anything outside these walls." It was technically true, she told herself. During the early hours of labor, she hadn't been aware of anything beyond her own pain. The lie by omission still tasted bitter in her mouth. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. Probably just someone seeking shelter, then moved on when they saw the cabin was occupied. But his expression remained troubled. "Still, it makes me uneasy. Morrison's been saying there's been more Indian activity in the area lately, thinks they might be planning something." The mention of James Morrison sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Morrison was the kind of man who saw threats everywhere, who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. If he started investigating the tracks around their cabin— "What kind of activity?" Sarah asked, trying to sound casually curious rather than desperately worried. "Signs of travel, mostly. Campsites, fire rings. Morrison thinks they're scouts, checking out settler homesteads." Thomas's voice carried the casual authority of someone repeating accepted wisdom. "He's organizing some of the men to do patrols. Make sure these savages know they're not welcome in civilized territory." Sarah felt sick. The idea of armed men hunting through the wilderness, looking for people like Ayana, made her stomach clench with fear and revulsion. But she couldn't show any of those feelings without raising questions she couldn't answer. "Patrols seem extreme," she managed to say. Thomas looked at her with surprise. "Extreme? Sarah, these are dangerous people we're talking about. They don't think like us, don't value life the way Christians do." He moved to check on Samuel, who was beginning to fuss. Just last month, Morrison heard about a family up north that was attacked, murdered in their beds, scalped, their cabin burned. Sarah had heard this story before, repeated with growing embellishment each time it was told. But now, having met Ayana, having seen her tenderness with the babies and her dedication to preserving life, the tale felt like a lie designed to justify cruelty. "Did anyone actually see what happened to that family?" Sarah asked carefully. "Or are we just assuming?" "Assuming." Thomas's voice sharpened. "Sarah, who else would do such a thing? These people have been raiding and murdering settlers since the first wagon trains came through. It's their nature." The casual certainty in his voice made Sarah realize how vast the chasm between them had become. Thomas was a good man in many ways, loving, hard-working, devoted to his family, but his hatred was so deeply ingrained, so unexamined, that he couldn't see it for what it was. "I suppose," Sarah said quietly, turning her attention to Samuel, to avoid meeting Thomas's eyes. That evening, Samuel developed a slight fever and began having trouble nursing. Sarah could see Thomas's worry as their son fretted and refused to settle, his tiny face flushed with heat. In the old days, which seemed like a lifetime ago now, Sarah would have been frantic, unsure what to do beyond cool cloths and prayer. Instead, she found herself thinking of Ayana's careful instructions. She waited until Thomas went out to tend the animals, then quickly prepared a weak tea from the herbs hidden in her sewing basket. The sweetgrass and mint steeped in hot water, creating a gentle aromatic brew that she cooled to lukewarm before offering tiny drops to Samuel on her fingertip. The effect was almost immediate. Samuel's fever broke within the hour, and his fretful crying ceased as his breathing eased. When Thomas returned, he found his son nursing contentedly while Sarah hummed a lullaby. "How did you—" Thomas stared in amazement. He was so sick, and now— "Mother's intuition," Sarah said, the phrase feeling rehearsed and hollow. "Sometimes you just know what to do." Thomas shook his head in wonder. First the difficult birth, now this. "Sarah, I think you might have a gift for healing." The irony was so painful that Sarah had to turn away. She did have a gift for healing. Now, but it was a gift that had been freely given by someone Thomas would consider less than human. The knowledge that coursed through her hands, the understanding of which herbs could bring down fever and ease breathing, all of it came from Ayana's generosity. Yet she could never acknowledge the source without destroying everything they had, built together. "Maybe," she said quietly, settling Samuel against her shoulder. "Maybe I do." Over the following days, Sarah found herself using Ayana's remedies again and again. When Mary developed a mild digestive upset, the right combination of herbs settled her stomach within hours. When Sarah herself felt the ache of recovery from childbirth, a different tea eased her pain and helped her healing. Each success felt like a miracle, but also like a betrayal of Ayana's trust in her discretion and of her own marriage through the necessary deceptions. Thomas noticed her growing confidence with the baby's health, praising her intuitive knowledge and natural mothering abilities. Each compliment deepened Sarah's isolation, creating a gulf between her true experience and the version of events that Thomas could accept. She began to understand that this was how secrets worked, not as single lies told once, but as ongoing performances that shaped every interaction. She had to remember her fabricated story, embellish it convincingly when questioned, and constantly monitor her responses to avoid revealing the truth that lay beneath. The loneliness was overwhelming. She had never felt so distant from Thomas, even when they were lying in bed together with the babies between them. He would reach for her hand or kiss her forehead, and all she could think about was how much of herself she was hiding from him, how the most transformative experience of her life had to remain forever secret because his prejudices made honesty impossible. On the morning of the 5th day, as Sarah was preparing breakfast while the babies slept, she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Thomas looked up from his coffee, listening intently to the hoofbeats drawing closer to their cabin. "Sounds like Morrison," he said, moving to the window. "Wonder what brings him out so early." Sarah's hands stilled on the skillet, her heart beginning to pound. James Morrison's visits were never social calls, and his timing felt ominous. As Thomas opened the door to greet their neighbor, Sarah caught sight of Morrison's grim expression and knew with cold certainty that their peaceful interlude was about to end. The weight of her secret pressed down harder than ever as Morrison's voice carried through the open door, speaking words that made her blood run cold. "Found something. You need to see, McKenna. Indian signs right here on your property. Recent ones." Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the skillet, the sound of metal against iron unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that followed Morrison's words. Through the open doorway she could see the man himself, tall, lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many years, nursing grievances against the world. His pale eyes swept the area around their cabin with the methodical intensity of someone accustomed to tracking prey. "Recent, you say?" Thomas's voice carried a note of alarm that made Sarah's chest tighten. "How recent?" Morrison dismounted from his horse with deliberate slowness, his gaze never leaving the ground around the cabin's perimeter. "Storm's been over for 5 days now. These tracks were made during it, or just after." He pulled a worn leather glove from his hand and crouched near what Sarah realized with horror were probably Ayana's footprints, partially filled with snow, but still visible to someone who knew how to look. "Are you certain they're Indian tracks?" Thomas asked, moving closer to examine the evidence. Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Been tracking these savages for 20 years, McKenna. I know the difference between a moccasin print and a boot." He stood, his eyes moving, from the tracks to the cabin door, where Sarah stood frozen in the threshold. "Question is, what was one of them doing here during the worst storm of the winter?" Sarah forced herself to step outside, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "Perhaps they were just seeking shelter from the weather," she suggested. Proud that her voice remained steady. The storm was terrible. Anyone caught in it would have needed to find cover. Morrison's pale eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "That's what your husband said. But here's the thing, Mrs. McKenna. These tracks don't circle the cabin like someone looking for shelter would. They come straight to your door. Stay for hours by the looks of it, then leave heading south." He pointed to faint depressions in the snow leading away from their property. "That's not the behavior of someone seeking temporary shelter. That's the behavior of someone who had business here." Thomas turned to look at Sarah, confusion and growing concern evident in his expression. "Sarah, are you absolutely certain you didn't see or hear anything during the storm? Anything at all?" The weight of 3 sets of eyes. Thomas's worried, Morrison's suspicious, and her own reflection in the cabin window behind them pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. She could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge, everything she'd worked to protect hanging in the balance of her next words. "I was in labor for most of the storm," she said firmly. "The pain was overwhelming. I might not have noticed. Someone at the door, unless they actually knocked." She met Morrison's stare directly, and no one knocked. Morrison nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. "Mind if I take a look around? Sometimes Indians leave other signs, marks on trees, arranged stones, things that tell other Indians what they found here." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to shrug with apparent indifference. "Of course, though I can't imagine what you'd find. We're hardly wealthy enough to interest anyone in stealing." As Morrison began his methodical examination of the area around their cabin, Sarah caught Thomas's arm. "What's this really about?" she asked quietly. "You're both acting like we're under siege." Thomas glanced toward Morrison, then lowered his voice. "There've been incidents. Livestock missing from the Patterson place. Strange signs around the Henderson cabin. Morrison thinks there's a band of renegades moving through the territory, possibly planning coordinated attacks." "Attacks?" Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral, but inside she felt sick. The idea that Ayana, who had risked her own safety to save 3 lives, could be hunted down as a dangerous criminal was almost unbearable. "Sarah," Thomas said seriously, I need you to understand how dangerous this situation could be. These aren't civilized people we're talking about. They don't think like us, don't value human life the way Christians do. If one of them was here during the storm..." He paused, his face pale with the implications. "With you helpless, alone, giving birth." The irony was so painful that Sarah had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. The savage Thomas feared had shown more compassion, skill, and humanity than anyone else in Sarah's experience. But she could see the genuine terror in her husband's eyes, terror based on stories and assumptions rather than experience, but no less real for that. "Nothing happened," Sarah said firmly. "The babies and I are fine. Whoever was here, if anyone, was here. They didn't harm us." Morrison's voice cut across their whispered conversation. "Found something over here." Both Thomas and Sarah turned toward where Morrison was crouched near the side of the cabin, examining something in the snow. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the area. It was where Ayana had gathered snow to melt for clean water during the birth. "What is it?" Thomas asked, moving closer. Morrison held up a small piece of bark, weathered and stained with what looked like dried herbs. "Medicine bark, the kind Indians use for their rituals." His voice carried disgust and suspicion in equal measure. "Fresh, too, dropped within the last week, I'd say." Sarah's mind raced. That piece of bark must have fallen from Ayana's bag during the frantic hours of the birth. Such a small thing, but potentially damning evidence in Morrison's hands. "Could be from anywhere," Sarah said quickly. "The wind during the storm was fierce. It could have blown debris from miles away." Morrison stood, turning the bark over in his fingers. "Could be. But medicine bark like this doesn't just blow around randomly, Mrs. McKenna. Indians carry it with them, use it for their healing ceremonies." His pale eyes fixed on her again. "Tell me, during your difficult birth, did you use any unusual remedies? Anything beyond what a Christian woman would normally rely on?" The question was loaded with threat, and Sarah felt the full weight of the danger she was in. Morrison wasn't just investigating random Indian activity. He was looking for evidence of collaboration, of settlers who might have aided or been aided by the enemy. "I used everything I could think of," Sarah replied carefully. "Prayer, mostly, and some old remedies my mother taught me. Herbs for pain, things like that." "What kind of herbs?" Morrison pressed. Sarah felt Thomas's surprised gaze on her. She had never mentioned using herbs during the birth, and now she had to construct a believable explanation on the spot. "Common things," she said, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "Willow bark for pain, mint for nausea. My mother always said women had to know these things, living so far from proper doctors." Morrison's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but before he could press further, Thomas intervened. "My wife delivered twins alone during a blizzard," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of protective pride. "I think she can be forgiven for trying whatever remedies she could remember." Morrison nodded grudgingly, but he pocketed the piece of bark. "I'll be keeping this, just in case. And I'll be talking to the other settlers in the area, seeing if anyone else has noticed signs of Indian activity." As Morrison prepared to leave, he turned back to address them both. "I want you to understand the seriousness of this situation. We're not talking about peaceful Indians looking for handouts. The signs I'm seeing suggest organized movement, coordinated activity. These savages might be planning something big." "What kind of something?" Thomas asked. Morrison's expression grew grim. "Could be anything. Raids on isolated homesteads, theft of livestock, or worse." He mounted his horse, looking down at them from the saddle. "My brother was killed by Indians 15 years ago, tortured for hours before they finally scalped him and burned him alive. That's the kind of mercy you can expect from these animals." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat, not just from the gruesome description, but from the casual hatred in Morrison's voice. This was the man who would be investigating any Indian presence in the area, a man whose grief had curdled into murderous prejudice. "What do you want us to do?" Thomas asked. "Stay alert. Keep your rifle loaded and close at hand. If you see any signs of Indian activity, tracks, smoke from unauthorized campfires, missing livestock, send word immediately." Morrison's gaze shifted to Sarah. "And Mrs. McKenna, if you remember anything else about that night, anything unusual you might have overlooked in the excitement of childbirth, I need to know about it." After Morrison rode away, Thomas stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the tracks in the snow. Sarah waited beside him, trying to read his expression, trying to gauge how much danger they were all in. "I don't like this," Thomas said, finally. "The idea that you were here alone, vulnerable, while some savage was prowling around our property." He turned to her, his face creased with worry. "Sarah, I want you to promise me something. If anything like this happens again, if you ever see signs of Indians around our cabin, you'll take the babies and go to the Morrison place immediately." Sarah felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. The Morrison place, where she would be protected by a man who collected pieces of bark as evidence against people whose only crime was existing in territory he considered exclusively his. "Thomas," she said carefully, "don't you think Morrison might be overreacting? I mean, one set of tracks in the snow hardly constitutes an organized threat." Thomas stared at her in surprise. "Overreacting? Sarah, Morrison knows Indians better than any man in the territory. If he says there's danger, there's danger." His voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never questioned the source of his beliefs. "These aren't people like us. They don't think like civilized human beings. They're guided by savage instincts, and they see weakness as an invitation to attack." Listening to her husband, this man she loved, who was gentle with his children and kind to his neighbors, speak with such casual dehumanization was almost unbearable. Sarah realized that the gulf between them was even wider than she had imagined. It wasn't just that she couldn't tell him about Ayanna. It was that the very worldview that made such telling impossible was fundamental to who Thomas was. "I suppose you're right," Sarah said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. That evening, as they prepared for bed with the babies sleeping peacefully between them, Thomas returned to the subject that clearly haunted him. "I keep thinking about those tracks," he said, checking his rifle for the third time that night. "Whoever it was, they came right up to our door, during the storm, when you were helpless." He set the gun within easy reach of the bed. "It makes me sick to think what could have happened." Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to her husband's troubled breathing and her baby's gentle sighs, and tried to reconcile the two realities that existed simultaneously in her mind. In one reality, Thomas was right to be worried. A stranger had indeed approached their cabin during her most vulnerable moment. In the other reality, that stranger had been the answer to her desperate prayers, the skilled hands that had saved 3 lives through knowledge and compassion. But only one of those realities could be spoken aloud in this world they inhabited together. The other would remain forever locked in Sarah's heart, a secret that grew heavier with each passing day, but could never be shared without destroying everything they had built together. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer, not for her own safety or her family's protection, but for Ayanna, somewhere out there in the wilderness, carrying her medicines and her stories from one place to another while men like Morrison hunted her with hatred in their hearts and violence in their hands. The piece of bark Morrison had found would be evidence now, added to whatever case he was building against the presence of savages in their territory. And Sarah, who owed her life and her children's lives to one of those supposed savages, could do nothing but lie silent in her bed and hope that Ayana was far away, safe from the men who would never understand that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. 3 days after Morrison's visit, Sarah heard the familiar sound of an approaching wagon and looked out to see Margaret Price making her careful way up the snow-packed trail to their cabin. Margaret was her nearest female neighbor, living some 4 miles south with her husband Robert and their 3 young children. She was a kind woman, practical and generous, the sort of person who appeared with hot meals and willing hands whenever a neighbor faced trouble. Sarah's heart sank as she watched Margaret's approach. Under normal circumstances, she would have welcomed the visit eagerly, the chance for female companionship, help with the babies, and news from the outside world. But nothing about her circumstances was normal anymore, and Margaret's well-meaning presence would be another test of Sarah's ability to maintain her carefully constructed fiction. "Sarah McKenna," Margaret called out as she climbed down from her wagon, her round face beaming with excitement and concern. "I came as soon as the trails were passable. How are you, dear? How are those precious babies?" Thomas emerged from the barn where he'd been tending their horse, his face lighting up at the sight of their neighbor. "Mrs. Price, what a welcome sight. Sarah's been doing wonderfully, but I know she'd appreciate another woman's company." Margaret bustled toward the cabin, her arms full of covered dishes and bundled supplies. "I brought soup and fresh bread and some things for the babies. Oh, Sarah, I can hardly believe you managed twins all alone in that terrible storm." She paused at the threshold, studying Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone who had attended many births. "You look well, considering. Tired, but that's to be expected." Sarah forced a smile as she stepped aside to let Margaret enter. "I'm managing. Thomas has been such a help since he returned." Margaret set her burdens on the table and immediately moved toward the cradle where Mary and Samuel lay sleeping. Her expression softened with the universal tenderness that women showed toward newborns, and she clasped her hands together in delight. "Oh, they're beautiful," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect, and so healthy-looking. Sarah, you must tell me everything. I've been dying to hear how you managed such a difficult birth without any help." Boom, as Margaret settled herself in the chair beside the fire, accepting the cup of coffee Thomas offered, Sarah found herself once again recounting her carefully edited version of events. But this time, telling the story to another woman felt different, more intimate, and therefore more treacherous. Margaret asked detailed questions about the labor, the baby's positions, the complications Sarah had faced. Each query required Sarah to elaborate on her deceptions, building a more complex web of lies. The second baby, Samuel, he had trouble breathing when he was born, Sarah explained, watching Margaret's face carefully. "For a few terrifying moments, I thought." She let her voice trail off, allowing Margaret to fill in the implied horror. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes wide with sympathy and fascination. "What did you do? How did you revive him?" "I tried something my mother once mentioned," Sarah said, the familiar fabrication feeling more practiced now. "An old remedy with herbs, mint, and other things. I barely remembered it, but desperation makes you try anything." "Herbs?" Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. "What kind of herbs? I've never heard of using plants to help babies breathe." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Margaret's innocent curiosity was pushing her toward more specific lies, details that might not hold up under scrutiny. "Common things, mostly. I'm not sure I could even identify them all now. When you're in that kind of panic, you just do what feels right." Margaret nodded slowly, though something in her expression suggested she found the explanation somewhat unsatisfying. "Well, whatever you did, It certainly worked. Both babies look absolutely thriving. Thomas, who had been listening from his position by the window, turned to join the conversation. My Sarah has always had good instincts about healing. Even before this, she knew just what to do when the livestock got sick, or when I had that fever last winter. It's a gift, Margaret agreed warmly. Some women just have the touch. Though I must say, Sarah, you were incredibly brave to attempt such a thing alone. Most women would have been paralyzed with fear. The praise felt like small cuts against Sarah's conscience. Every compliment emphasized how her supposed courage was built on a foundation of lies, how the real courage had belonged to Ayana, courage to help a stranger despite the risks, courage to share precious knowledge across cultural boundaries, courage to preserve life in the face of hatred and misunderstanding. I was terrified, Sarah said quietly, which was at least completely true. I don't know how I managed it, honestly. Margaret reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. God gives us strength when we need it most. He must have been watching over you that night. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. In her mind, God's providence had indeed been present that night, in the form of an elderly Creek woman who appeared through the storm with healing in her hands and wisdom in her heart. But that truth would sound like blasphemy to Margaret's ears. Speaking of that night, Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone, have you heard about what Morrison discovered? The Indian tracks around your property? Sarah's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Thomas mentioned it. Apparently someone was in the area during the storm. Margaret's face grew grave. Sarah, it's much more serious than that. Morrison's found evidence of organized Indian activity throughout the territory. He thinks there might be a war party moving through, planning coordinated attacks on isolated homesteads. A war party? Sarah tried to sound appropriately alarmed, rather than sick with worry for Ayana's safety. Morrison's organizing the men into search parties, Margaret continued. They're going to comb the territory, looking for Indian camps, trails, anything that might lead them to these savages before they can strike. Her voice carried the excited fear of someone thrilled to be part of a dramatic story. Robert's joining up, of course. He says it's our Christian duty to protect innocent families from these heathens. Sarah felt as if the walls of the cabin were closing in around her. The idea of armed men hunting through the wilderness, looking for people like Ayana, made her physically ill. But she couldn't show any of those feelings without raising dangerous questions. Do they really think the danger is that serious? Sarah asked carefully. Margaret leaned forward conspiratorially. Morrison says the signs are unmistakable. These Indians aren't just passing through. They're scouting our defenses, learning our routines. The fact that one was bold enough to approach your cabin during the storm proves they have no fear of us. She shuddered dramatically. Thank God you were in labor and didn't hear them prowling around. If you'd gone to the door... Sarah bit back the response that rose to her lips. If she had gone to the door, she would have met a woman whose knowledge and compassion had saved 3 lives. But in Margaret's world, opening that door would have meant certain death or worse. I keep thinking about poor Mary Henderson, Margaret continued, referring to a woman Sarah knew only by reputation, living alone with her children while her husband's away on business. Morrison says she needs to move into town until this threat passes. No woman should be alone in the wilderness with these savages on the prowl. What exactly are they planning to do? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Margaret's expression grew hard in a way that surprised Sarah. Her neighbor was usually so gentle, so focused on domestic concerns and community harmony. But now there was something almost bloodthirsty in her eyes. Whatever's necessary to protect our families, Margaret said firmly. Morrison says we can't afford to show weakness. These animals only understand force. She gestured toward the Sleeping babies. We have to think about our children's safety. What kind of world are we leaving them if we let these savages run wild through our territory? Sarah looked at Mary and Samuel, sleeping peacefully in their cradle, and felt her heart break a little more. These children owed their lives to one of the savages Margaret spoke of with such casual hatred, but they would grow up in a world where that truth could never be spoken, where the very person who had saved them would be hunted and possibly killed by their own community. "I suppose you're right," Sarah said quietly, the words tasting like poison. Margaret seemed to take her subdued response as shock rather than moral conflict. "Oh dear, I'm frightening you, aren't I? Here you are, just recovered from childbirth, and I'm filling your head with worries about Indian attacks." She reached over and patted Sarah's arm reassuringly. "Don't you fret, Sarah. The men will handle this. Morrison knows how to deal with these situations. He's been tracking Indians for years." "Has he?" Sarah asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her caution. "I mean, has he actually encountered them before?" Margaret nodded grimly. "Oh, yes. He was there when his brother was killed. You?" "No. Saw the whole horrible thing. That's why he knows how dangerous they are, how little mercy we can expect from them." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "He says they tortured poor Jim Morrison for hours before they finally killed him. Did unspeakable things. That's why James is so determined to prevent other families from suffering the same fate." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the cabin's chinks. Morrison's hatred wasn't just abstract prejudice, it was personal, fueled by trauma and loss. That made him infinitely more dangerous, because his grief had convinced him that vengeance was justice. "How terrible," Sarah murmured, and meant it. The cycle of violence and retribution that had shaped this territory was a tragedy for everyone involved. But she couldn't help wondering about the other side of Morrison's story. What had led to his brother's death? What context had been lost in the telling and retelling of the tale? "The worst part," Margaret continued, seemingly encouraged by Sarah's sympathy, "is how these savages take advantage of Christian mercy. They'll come to your door pretending to be peaceful, asking for food or shelter, and then—" She shuddered. "Again. That's probably what happened the night your babies were born. Some Indian saw the smoke from your chimney and came investigating, hoping to find easy prey." The irony was so painful that Sarah had to press her lips together to keep from crying out. Yes, someone had come to their door that night, drawn by the smoke and the light, but instead of bringing violence, they had brought salvation. Instead of taking advantage of Sarah's vulnerability, they had used their own knowledge and strength to preserve 3 lives. "Thank God nothing happened," Margaret concluded. "You and the babies were under divine protection that night." "Yes," Sarah whispered. "We were." They were interrupted by Thomas calling from outside, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made both women look toward the door with curiosity. "Sarah! Mrs. Price! Come see this!" Margaret rose immediately, her natural curiosity overcoming any concern about propriety. Sarah followed more slowly, her heart sinking as she wondered what new evidence might have been discovered. Outside, Thomas stood near the tree line at the edge of their property, holding something in his hands. As they approached, Sarah could see that it was another piece of bark, similar to the one Morrison had found, but larger and more obviously worked by human hands. "Found this caught on a branch about 50 yards from the cabin," Thomas said, his voice tight with concern. "It's definitely Indian work. You can see where it's been carved and treated." Margaret examined the bark with the fascination of someone viewing an exotic artifact. Are those symbols carved into it?" Sarah looked at the bark and felt her blood turn to ice. She recognized it immediately. It was one of Ayana's medicine wrappings, the outer layer that had protected her precious herbs during the storm. The symbols weren't random markings, but carefully carved representations of healing plants, a mnemonic system that helped identify the contents of each bundle. "Morrison needs to see this immediately," Margaret said firmly. "This proves there was definitely Indian activity around your cabin. They might have been marking it for a future attack." Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll ride over to his place this afternoon. This changes everything." As Sarah stared at the bark that would become further evidence against Ayanna, she realized that her passive silence was no longer enough. Each piece of evidence that Morrison collected brought him closer to tracking down the woman who had saved her family. Each conversation filled with casual hatred and calls for violence made Sarah complicit in the very prejudice that threatened innocent lives. "Maybe," Sarah said carefully, "we shouldn't jump to conclusions about what this means." Both Thomas and Margaret turned to look at her with surprise. In their world, Indian artifacts found on settler property could only mean one thing: danger, threat, the need for immediate and violent response. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, her tone suggesting she found Sarah's comment both puzzling and mildly alarming. Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could continue her silence, continue to let others build a case that might lead to Ayanna's death. Or she could begin to speak, carefully and gradually, truths that might plant seeds of doubt in the minds of people she cared about. "I just mean," Sarah said slowly, "that we don't really know what this bark was used for, or who left it, or why." She gestured toward the carved symbols. "For all we know, it could be medicine bark, not war markings." Margaret's eyes widened with what looked like shock. "Medicine bark? Sarah, these are Indians we're talking about. They don't have medicine the way civilized people do. They have rituals, superstitions, dark practices that mock God's healing power." The casual dismissal of everything Ayanna represented, the knowledge that had saved Samuel's life, the traditions passed down through generations of healers, was more than Sarah could bear in silence. "But what if," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger despite her fear, "what if their medicine actually works? What if we've been wrong about what they know?" The silence that followed her words was deafening. Thomas and Margaret stared at her as if she had suddenly begun speaking in tongues, their faces reflecting confusion, concern, and something that might have been alarm. "Sarah," Thomas said carefully, "are you feeling all right? You've been through a tremendous ordeal. Sometimes, after childbirth, women can have unusual thoughts." Margaret nodded sagely. "It's the exhaustion, dear. You're not thinking clearly. Of course, Indian medicine doesn't work. If it did, wouldn't they be as healthy and prosperous as Christian people? Wouldn't their children live instead of dying in infancy? Their medicine is just superstition mixed with devil worship." Sarah felt the familiar weight of her secret pressing down on her, but now it was accompanied by something new, a burning need to speak truth, even if she couldn't speak the whole truth. These people she loved were preparing to hunt down and possibly kill someone who had shown more Christian charity than anyone Sarah had ever met. Their ignorance was willful, their hatred comfortable, and their certainty absolute. "I'm just saying," Sarah persisted, "that maybe we don't know as much about them as we think we do. Maybe the stories we tell aren't complete." Thomas moved closer to her, his face creased with worry. "Sarah, what's brought this on? You sound like you're defending them." The accusation hung in the air like a physical threat. In their community, defending Indians was tantamount to treason, a betrayal of everything they claimed to stand for. Sarah realized she had reached a crossroads. She could retreat back into safe silence, or she could continue down a path that might cost her everything she had built in this life. Looking at her husband's concerned face, at Margaret's shocked expression, at the piece of bark that represented both evidence against Ayana and proof of her generous nature, Sarah made her choice. "Maybe I am," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time someone did." The confrontation with Thomas and Margaret that winter day had marked a turning point in Sarah's life, though not in the way she had hoped. Her tentative defense of indigenous knowledge had been met with such alarm and concern that she had been forced to retreat, claiming exhaustion and the lingering effects of childbirth for her strange ideas. But the seed had been planted, and, over the long winter months that followed, Sarah found herself unable to return to her former ignorance. Now, as spring painted the Montana territory in shades of green and gold, Sarah stood at her cabin window watching Mary and Samuel take their first tentative steps in the wildflower meadow behind their home. At 8 months old, the twins were thriving, healthy, curious, and blessed with the robust constitution that Ayana's medicines had helped establish in their earliest days. Every time Sarah looked at them, she was reminded of the debt they all owed to a woman whose very existence had to remain secret. The winter had passed without the Indian raids Morrison had predicted. His search parties had found no camps, no war parties, no evidence of the coordinated threat he had sworn was imminent. Gradually, the community's vigilance had relaxed, though. Morrison himself remained convinced that the danger was only temporarily dormant. He still stopped by occasionally, asking if Sarah had remembered any additional details about the night of the storm, his pale eyes searching her face for signs of deception he could never quite identify. Sarah had become expert at maintaining her fiction, but the cost of the constant performance was wearing on her spirit. She felt increasingly isolated from Thomas, who remained baffled by her occasional strange moods and her reluctance to join in the community's casual discussions about Indian threats. Their marriage had not broken, but it had developed cracks that neither of them quite knew how to address. The medicine bundles Ayana had left behind remained hidden in Sarah's sewing basket, occasionally accessed when the twins showed signs of minor illness, but otherwise untouched. Sarah had become skilled at attributing their effectiveness to mother's intuition or old family remedies, deflecting questions about their origins with practiced ease. But each success felt like a betrayal of Ayana's memory, a denial of the sophisticated knowledge system that had saved their lives. It was on a bright morning in late May that Sarah's carefully maintained equilibrium was shattered by a frantic pounding on her cabin door. She opened it to find Margaret Price, her face streaked with tears and her usual composure completely destroyed. "Sarah, thank God you're here," Margaret gasped, clutching at Sarah's arm with desperate fingers. "It's little Emma. She's dying, and the doctor is 3 days away in Helena. You have to help us." Emma was Margaret's youngest daughter, a sweet-natured child of 4 who had always been delicate but never seriously ill. Sarah invited Margaret inside, settling her with a cup of coffee while she tried to understand what was happening. "She started with a fever 2 days ago," Margaret explained, her voice shaking. "But this morning she began having trouble breathing, and now—" She broke down completely. "She can barely draw breath, Sarah. She's turning blue around her lips. Robert has ridden to fetch the doctor, but even if he finds him immediately, it will be days before they return." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The symptoms Margaret described were terrifyingly familiar. They matched exactly what she had witnessed in Samuel during his first moments of life. She could picture Ayana's calm hands working over the baby, the careful selection of herbs, the precise ritual that had opened his airways and restored his breathing. "Have you tried anything?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Margaret nodded miserably. "Everything I know. Cool cloths for the fever, propping her up to help her breathe. Prayer." She looked at Sarah with desperate hope. But you have such a gift for healing. The way you saved Samuel when he couldn't breathe, the remedies you used during your birth. Please, Sarah, if there's anything you can think of. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Here was a situation where Ayana's knowledge could save another child's life, but using it would require explanations that might expose everything she had worked to keep hidden. The safe choice would be to express sympathy, offer what conventional help she could, and hope that the doctor arrived in time. The dangerous choice would be to act on knowledge that officially didn't exist. "Let me see her," Sarah said quietly. The ride to the Price homestead felt endless, even though Sarah knew it was less than an hour. Margaret had left the twins with Thomas, who was confused by the emergency but trusted Sarah's judgment about medical matters. As they bounced along the rutted trail in Margaret's wagon, Sarah tried to prepare herself for what she might find and for the decisions she might have to make. The Price cabin was larger than Sarah's own, built to accommodate a family that had been in the territory longer and had achieved greater prosperity. But today, it felt like a tomb, filled with the shallow, labored breathing of a dying child and the hushed voices of people who had run out of hope. Robert Price was there, having decided not to make the trip to Helena after all, when it became clear that Emma might not survive long enough for the doctor's return. He stood beside his daughter's bed with the helpless expression of a man accustomed to solving problems with physical strength and practical solutions, neither of which had any power against the mysterious illness that was stealing his child's breath. Emma lay in the small bed, her face flushed with fever, but her lips and fingernails tinged with the frightening blue that Sarah remembered from Samuel's birth. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, each inhalation obviously a struggle. Most terrifying of all was the sound, a high-pitched wheeze that spoke of airways that were closing, cutting off the flow of life itself. "How long has she been like this?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the bed and gently placing her hand on Emma's burning forehead. "Since dawn," Robert replied, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "It came on so suddenly. Yesterday she was just tired and feverish, but this morning—" He gestured helplessly at his daughter's labored breathing. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember everything Ayana had taught her about breathing troubles. The herbs she had used for Samuel, the way she had burned them to create healing smoke, the gentle massage techniques that had helped open blocked airways. All of it was there in Sarah's memory, preserved with perfect clarity, because it had been learned in a moment of desperate need. But using that knowledge would require explaining where she had learned it, and in a community where Morrison's suspicions still simmered just below the surface, where any suggestion of Indian influence was met with fear and hostility, such explanations could prove catastrophic for everyone involved. "I might know something that could help," Sarah said carefully, "but it would require unusual methods, things that might seem strange." Margaret grabbed her arm again. "I don't care if it seems strange. I don't care if it seems impossible. If there's even a chance it could save her, you have to try." Robert nodded grimly. "Whatever you need, Sarah, whatever you think might work." The trust in their voices was both heartwarming and terrifying. They were placing their daughter's life in Sarah's hands based on their faith in her supposed healing abilities. Abilities that were actually borrowed from someone they would consider their mortal enemy. "I'll need some things," Sarah said, making her decision. "Certain herbs, if you have them, and privacy while I work." What followed was the most dangerous hour of Sarah's life since the night of the twins' birth. Working from memory of Ayana's techniques, she prepared a mixture of herbs that she claimed were old family remedies, passed down from her grandmother. She burned sweetgrass and wild mint, creating aromatic smoke that she wafted gently toward Emma's face while speaking what she claimed were prayers, but were actually fragments of the Creek chants she remembered Ayanna using. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Emma's breathing began to ease, the frightening wheeze subsiding as her airways opened. Her color improved from the deadly blue-gray to a healthier pink, and her fever broke under the influence of herbs that Sarah couldn't possibly explain, knowing how to use. When Margaret and Robert were finally allowed back into the room, they found their daughter sleeping peacefully, her breathing deep and regular for the first time in days. Margaret fell to her knees beside the bed, tears of relief streaming down her face, while Robert stood in stunned amazement. "How?" was all Robert could manage to say. Sarah felt the familiar weight of necessary deception settling over her. "Old remedies," she said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "Things my grandmother taught my mother, passed down through generations of women." But Margaret was too intelligent and too observant to accept such a simple explanation. She looked at the remaining herbs Sarah had used, inhaled the lingering scent of the medicinal smoke, and studied Sarah's face with growing curiosity. "I've never seen herbs like these," Margaret said slowly. "And the way you used them, the songs you were singing. Sarah, where did you really learn these things?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, demanding an answer that Sarah couldn't give without destroying everything she had built. But looking at Emma's peaceful face, seeing the gratitude and wonder in her parents' eyes, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. The weight of her secret had been crushing her for months, isolating her from the people she loved and forcing her to deny the most transformative experience of her life. "I learned them," Sarah said quietly, "from someone who saved my children's lives." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see the wheels turning in Margaret's mind as she processed this admission, trying to reconcile it with everything she thought she knew about the night of the twins' birth. "Someone was there," Margaret said slowly. "The night Mary and Samuel were born. Someone helped you." Sarah nodded, no longer able to maintain the fiction that had protected them all. "Someone who knew more about healing than any doctor I've ever met. Someone who risked their own safety to help a stranger in need." Robert's face was growing dark with understanding and alarm. "Sarah, what exactly are you telling us?" Before Sarah could answer, the cabin door opened and James Morrison walked in, apparently having heard about Emma's illness and come to offer assistance. His presence filled the small room with immediate tension, his pale eyes taking in the scene, the sleeping child, the strange herbs, the emotional aftermath of whatever had just transpired. "Heard the little one was sick," Morrison said, his voice carrying its usual undertone of suspicion. "Glad to see she's improved." His gaze fixed on the remaining herbs scattered on the nearby table. "Interesting medicine you've been using, Mrs. McKenna." Sarah felt her heart stop. Morrison's expertise in tracking had extended to botanical knowledge, and she could see recognition dawning in his expression as he examined the herbs she had used. These weren't plants that grew in typical settler gardens or appeared in conventional medical texts. They were the specialized medicines of indigenous healers, and their presence in this room raised questions that Sarah was no longer sure she could deflect. "Where exactly did you learn to use plants like these?" Morrison asked, his voice deceptively casual, but his eyes sharp with growing suspicion. Sarah looked around the room, at Emma sleeping peacefully, at Margaret and Robert, watching her with confusion and growing alarm, at Morrison, whose hatred had driven him to hunt for any evidence of Indian influence in their community. She thought of Ayanna, somewhere in the wilderness, carrying her knowledge and her stories from place to place, while men like Morrison sought to destroy everything she represented. And in that moment, Sarah McKenna made the choice that would define the rest of her life. "I learned them," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent room, from a Creek medicine woman named Ayana, who appeared at my cabin during the blizzard and saved the lives of my children and myself. She was the bravest, wisest, most compassionate person I have ever met, and if you want to arrest me for being grateful to her, then arrest me. But I will not stand by and watch another child suffer when I have knowledge that can help, no matter where that knowledge came from." The explosion of voices that followed her declaration was immediate and chaotic. Morrison's face went white with rage. Robert began shouting questions and demands for explanation, and Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that everything she thought she knew about that winter night had been a lie. But through it all, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The weight of her secret was gone, lifted from her shoulders by the simple act of speaking truth. Whatever consequences followed, whatever price she had to pay for her honesty, it would be worth it to finally honor the woman who had given her everything. "That woman," Morrison said, his voice shaking with fury, "was part of a war party. She was scouting our defenses, learning our weaknesses. And you," he pointed an accusing finger at Sarah, "you aided and comforted the enemy." "That woman," Sarah replied with equal intensity, "delivered my twins when I was dying, saved my son's life when he couldn't breathe, and left behind medicines that have helped my children thrive. If that makes her an enemy, then I'm proud to have been helped by such an enemy." Margaret finally found her voice. "Sarah, do you understand what you're saying? Do you realize what this means?" Sarah looked at her friend, this woman whose child now breathed easily because of knowledge passed down through generations of Creek healers, and smiled sadly. "It means," Sarah said, "that the world is more complicated than we've been taught to believe. It means that wisdom and compassion can come from unexpected places, and it means that maybe, if we're brave enough to listen, we can learn to see beyond the stories that divide us." Morrison stepped toward the door, his intention clear. "This matter will be reported to the territorial authorities. Aiding Indians is a crime, Mrs. McKenna, regardless of your emotional attachment to the situation." "Then report it," Sarah said calmly. "Report that a Creek woman saved 3 lives during a blizzard. Report that her medicines cured a child. Report that she showed more Christian charity than anyone in this community has ever managed." She stood straighter, feeling strength flow through her that she hadn't known she possessed. "And when you write your report, ask yourself this: what kind of people are we if we punish someone for choosing life over death?" As Morrison stormed out to carry word of her confession to anyone who would listen, Sarah sat beside Emma's bed and took the child's small hand in hers. The little girl's breathing was steady and strong, her fever completely broken. In a few hours, she would wake up healthy and whole, saved by knowledge that had crossed cultural boundaries to preserve life. Margaret and Robert sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that their daughter owed her life to someone they had been taught to hate and fear. But gradually, as they watched their child sleep peacefully, Sarah could see understanding beginning to dawn in their eyes. "She really saved them?" Margaret asked quietly. "Your babies would have died without her." "All 3 of us would have died," Sarah confirmed. "She had every reason to pass by our cabin and leave us to our fate. Instead, she risked her own safety to help strangers. She gave us gifts of knowledge and medicine that she could have kept for her own people, and she asked for nothing in return except that we live." Robert cleared his throat roughly. "And now Emma. Now Emma lives because that knowledge was passed on," Sarah finished. "Because Ayana believed that healing wisdom should be shared wherever it's needed, regardless of who needs it." As the afternoon wore on and word of Sarah's confession spread throughout the small community, neighbors began arriving at the Price cabin. Some came in anger, demanding explanations and calling for Sarah's arrest. Others came in curiosity, wanting to understand how such an impossible situation had unfolded. But increasingly, as they saw Emma playing happily in her mother's arms, alive and healthy when she had been dying that morning, they came in quiet wonder. Thomas arrived as the sun was setting, his face a mixture of hurt, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He found Sarah sitting on the cabin's front porch, watching their own twins play in the grass, while she waited for whatever judgment the community would render. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, settling beside her on the wooden steps. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand. Because I knew it would change everything between us. Because I was afraid of losing everything I loved for the sake of honoring someone you could never see as human." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching Mary and Samuel chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "The twins," he said finally, "they really would have died." "Yes. And this woman, Ayana, she asked for nothing except that we live well, and that we remember that wisdom comes from many places." Thomas turned to look at his wife, seeing her as if for the first time. "You've been carrying this alone for months." "It was my burden to carry," Sarah said simply, "my choice to make." "No," Thomas said slowly, "it was our burden, our choice. His voice carrying its usual undertone of suspicion. "Glad to see she's improved." His gaze fixed on the remaining herbs scattered on the nearby table. "Interesting medicine you've been using, Mrs. McKenna." Sarah felt her heart stop. Morrison's expertise in tracking had extended to botanical knowledge, and she could see recognition dawning in his expression as he examined the herbs she had used. These weren't plants that grew in typical settler gardens or appeared in conventional medical texts. They were the specialized medicines of indigenous healers, and their presence in this room raised questions that Sarah was no longer sure she could deflect. "Where exactly did you learn to use plants like these?" Morrison asked, his voice deceptively casual, but his eyes sharp with growing suspicion. Sarah looked around the room, at Emma sleeping peacefully, at Margaret and Robert, watching her with confusion and growing alarm, at Morrison, whose hatred had driven him to hunt for any evidence of Indian influence in their community. She thought of Ayana, somewhere in the wilderness, carrying her knowledge and her stories from place to place, while men like Morrison sought to destroy everything she represented. And in that moment, Sarah McKenna made the choice that would define the rest of her life. "I learned them," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent room, "from a Creek medicine woman named Ayana, who appeared at my cabin during the blizzard and saved the lives of my children and myself. She was the bravest, wisest, most compassionate person I have ever met, and if you want to arrest me for being grateful to her, then arrest me. But I will not stand by and watch another child suffer when I have knowledge that can help, no matter where that knowledge came from." The explosion of voices that followed her declaration was immediate and chaotic. Morrison's face went white with rage. Robert began shouting questions and demands for explanation, and Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that everything she thought she knew about that winter night had been a lie. But through it all, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Should have. If I hadn't been so. He struggled with words, trying to articulate thoughts he had never allowed himself to think. Maybe I've been wrong about some things. As they sat together in the peaceful evening air, watching their children play and listening to the soft sounds of Emma's laughter drifting from inside the cabin, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that winter night. Hope, not just for her own family, but for the possibility that understanding could grow from honest conversation, that prejudice could be challenged by lived experience, and that maybe, just maybe, the world could change one heart at a time. Morrison. would make his reports, and there would be consequences for her honesty. The territorial authorities might decide that aiding Indians was indeed a crime worthy of punishment. But Sarah had made her choice, and in making it, she had honored both Ayana's memory and the lessons her children would carry into whatever future awaited them all. The twins toddled over to their parents as full darkness fell, climbing into Sarah's lap with the trusting affection of children who had never known anything but love and safety. As she held them close, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for their lives, but for the woman who had made those lives possible, and for the courage to finally speak the truth that honor demanded, somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded their small community. Ayana continued her journey, carrying her medicines and her stories from one place to another. She would never know that her sacrifice had been acknowledged, that her knowledge had saved another child, or that her example had given one settler woman the courage to speak across the divisions that separated their peoples. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the true legacy of that winter night wasn't in the gratitude that could be spoken, but in the understanding that could be lived. In a world where fear and hatred seemed to dominate every interaction between different peoples, one moment of genuine connection had planted seeds that might, generations later, grow into something resembling peace. As Sarah carried her sleeping children back to their own cabin, she looked up at the star-filled sky that stretched endlessly above the Montana Territory and whispered a promise to the woman who had saved them all. "Your knowledge lives on. Your wisdom will be remembered. And maybe someday our children will live in a world where saving lives is celebrated rather than punished, regardless of whose hands do the saving." The wind carried her words into the darkness, where they joined. The eternal conversation between hope and reality, between what is and what might someday be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.